Just a few days after Pope Francis passed away, when Jeremy Renner appeared on a late-night show, viewers were expecting something simple, a warm conversation, maybe some sarcastic jokes, a few movie memories. But from the very beginning, things weren't going as planned. The host was trying to lighten the mood, but Jeremy didn't seem to care about the script. He was distant, tense, and cautious. Then suddenly his eyes fell on the table. No one had noticed it, but there was a gold rosary lying there, placed there silently. In that moment, the atmosphere in the studio changed. The questions changed direction. So did the answers. What had started as a routine segment suddenly turned into something completely different. Jeremy began to talk about something he had kept silent about for years: live on air. This wasn't just a confession, it was the unexpected revelation of faith, strength, and hidden truths. When the final words were spoken, there was no applause. It was a testimony. Jeremy Renner was breaking his silence after a secret meeting at the Vatican, and what he said had the power to shake everything we thought we knew about the sacred. Before continuing, don't forget to write your favorite thing about Jeremy Renner in the comments. The lights in the studio flickered for a moment, then shone steadily. The LED glow of the cameras illuminated the faces of the audience. Normally, this would have been just another night show. Celebrity gossip, Hollywood smiles, superficial entertainment. But tonight was different. It wasn't just the shadow of the Pope's death that made the difference. The host greeted the audience with all his energy, with a graceful smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Renner!" Applause. Some audience members stood up. Despite breaking the rules, a few people secretly raised their phones to record. He was wearing a black suit, but no tie. His hair was a bit longer, and his face had a familiar yet tired expression. Jeremy entered with heavy, determined steps. The audience couldn't take their eyes off him. The host extended his hand, and Jeremy shook it briefly. They took their seats. On the table was a glass of water, a few cards, and a small golden rosary resting on a dark blue velvet cushion. It wasn't hard to see, but its presence was an unexplained mystery. The host began speaking to lighten the mood. "Strange times, aren't they? The Pope has passed away. But you're still standing strong. What's your secret? Is it holy water?" Laughter filled the studio, but Jeremy only smiled slightly. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the rosary. It wasn't just a brief glance. He was staring at it intently. The audience didn't notice at first, but within a few seconds, a heavy, oppressive silence fell. The host tried to smile. "Is everything okay?" he said, his voice nervous. "You seem different tonight, more introverted." Jeremy took a deep breath. He reached out and touched his prayer beads with his fingertips. His gaze drifted away. It was as if a burden from the past had returned to weigh on his shoulders. "That night in Rome, he told me something," he said in a low voice. His words were not an explanation, but a confession. The host leaned forward slightly. The audience fell completely silent. Everyone instinctively realized that this was no longer a normal program. "Maybe it's time," Jeremy added. "If I have to tell this story, tonight is the night." The studio was frozen. The audience couldn't tell if this was a commercial break or a real moment. But Jeremy wasn't faking it. There was no theatrical expression on his face, no rehearsed lines. The host tried to compose himself. "What are you going to tell us?" Jeremy looked at him, but his gaze wasn't on the surface, it was deep. "There's something Pope Francis left me," he said. "Something he didn't want buried with him." The room was almost silent. The host glanced at his earpiece, but there was no response. Jeremy hadn't come here to advertise or put on a show. Jeremy hadn't come there to have fun either. He began to speak slowly. His voice wasn't soft, but it was honest and clear. "Years ago," he said, "I received an invitation that seemed unreal." He leaned forward slightly in his chair, the rosary still on the table in front of him. "I was in Florence. I was in a small, independent European film. That night, there was a knock on my hotel door." His eyes were blank. There was someone standing there. He didn't say his name. He just handed me an envelope with the Vatican seal on it. The studio held its breath. The invitation inside the envelope wasn't a formal one. There was no title, no seal, just handwriting. Jeremy lowered his gaze. It was a note written by Pope Francis himself. The host's eyebrows rose slightly. What did it say? He asked, his voice low but full of curiosity. Jeremy looked into the distance before answering, as if rereading the letter in his mind. I want to take a quiet walk among the olive trees with you, it said. Just that, no cameras, no media, just silence. At that moment, the atmosphere in the studio became sacred. A weight settled. Did you go? The host asked, his voice a little louder than a whisper. Jeremy nodded. I went. I didn't know what I wanted. Maybe support, maybe just a face. But what I found was much bigger than I had imagined. He paused. The audience was still. They picked me up at midnight from the back door of the Vatican. The car was simple but clean. There was an old man at the door. The corridors were like a labyrinth. We walked without speaking. Then we came out into a garden. He paused for a moment. There, under an olive tree, he was waiting. Pope Francis. He took a deeper breath. He looked tired, physically weak, but his eyes were more alive than anything I'd ever seen. The host didn't interrupt. The entire studio was spellbound. He got straight to the point. He had seen a video, a moment when I secretly visited a children's hospital. He said, silence is sometimes more powerful than a sermon. Jeremy's voice faltered. Then, he confessed. When he said that he felt God had been silent to him for years, the atmosphere in the studio changed. His words hit like a hammer. A chill fell over the room. What he was talking about wasn't just faith. It was about carrying Peter's chair, speaking in God's name, but getting no response. About loneliness, about silence. Jeremy turned his eyes to the audience, this time directly. It was as if he was searching for something inside them. Wait, the Pope had said, faith conquers silence. But one day, silence will be imitated. Those who appear silent but are empty inside will emerge. The host leaned forward slowly. What did you say? He asked in a tone that was simpler than he had ever used before. Jeremy shrugged. Nothing, I was just listening. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers were slow but steady. He pulled out a dark red envelope, still sealed, with frayed edges. It bore the papal coat of arms sealed with red wax. If I never see you again, the Pope had said, this secret must go with you to the grave. Those words echoed like a bell unseen in the studio. The host leaned forward slightly. Did you open it that night? Jeremy shook his head. No, I didn't even touch it. I carried it with me for years. I took it to film sets. It sat on my bedside table in hotel rooms. But I never opened it. I always told myself it wasn't mine. He paused. His eyes were on the small gold rosary on the table. But when I heard he had died, something changed. He slowly picked up the envelope. He held it as if it were a sacred relic. The audience began to stir, but no one made a sound. The host cleared his throat. Are you going to open it now? Jeremy didn't answer. His eyes shifted to the camera. Then he raised the envelope toward the camera. He broke the seal silently. The sound of the wax breaking was the clearest thing in the entire studio. It was as if time had stopped. He opened the envelope. His hands didn't tremble. He didn't look like someone playing a role, but like someone carrying something important. He took out the page. He began reading slowly. His eyes were still on the audience. Not to speak, not to show, but to understand. The host turned to Jeremy, but he couldn't say a word. The audience leaned forward involuntarily as if drawn by something invisible. Jeremy held the paper in his hands. His voice didn't crack, but it was deep. This world doesn't need more saints, more gold, he read. It needs men who will carry the light in the shadow of those who should protect it. His fingers weren't trembling, but there was a slight tension in his hands, not from fear, but from respect. I write this, Jeremy said, with a heart torn between duty and despair. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he continued. For years I fought behind marble walls. While swimming in a sea of secrets, I wore a fisherman's crown. He paused, his throat tightened. In this church, there are things I can never cleanse. He swallowed. They carry crosses on their chests, but they move like wolves. The host opened his mouth but fell silent when he looked into Jeremy's eyes. I tried to expose them, Jeremy said, but I failed. There was a moment of silence. Then Jeremy continued, "And now, if my voice is silenced, I want you, a stranger untouched by this world's politics, to protect this truth, not to destroy it, to carry it in silence." He reached the end of the paper but didn't stop. He pulled out another page. And at the end of the letter, he said, raising his head, there was something else. He opened the second page. His eyes narrowed. His voice was almost a whisper. "A vision," he murmured. "A prophecy." The host leaned forward involuntarily. "Was it written by the Pope?" Jeremy shook his head. He took a deep breath. "The one who will destroy me will not be one of us. He will not smile. He will look like a friend, but he will carry only emptiness inside." The sentence echoed in the studio like a murmur. The host looked at Jeremy in astonishment. Jeremy continued, "The collapse of faith will not come from heresy, but from imitation, from a figure who appears empty but harmless. And this will lead people away from the true meaning of faith." Then there was silence again. Jeremy whispered, "I didn't quite understand what you meant then. But after that letter, everything changed." The host asked in a low voice, "What do you mean?" Jeremy fixed his eyes on him. "I didn't talk," he said, "to anyone. I just worked. I researched. Faith, silence, power. I tried to figure out what you meant." He paused. A startling seriousness had come over his face. And then they started coming. The host leaned forward slightly. "Who?" Jeremy was now looking directly into the camera. "Warnings," he said. "Anonymous letters, no name. But they were all connected to him." He held the second page in both hands. But it didn't just look like a piece of paper. He raised his head. His eyes scanned the studio. Then he turned to the audience. "This part, I've never read this aloud to anyone before." Even the crew behind the camera paused. Everyone held their breath. Jeremy took a deep breath and read from the second page. "The person who will destroy me won't come from within. They won't smile. They'll dress like a friend. But inside, they'll carry only emptiness." A murmur rose in the studio, as if the wind were blowing dry leaves. The host didn't move, as if even breathing would ruin the moment. Jeremy silently folded the page and placed the letter next to the rosary. "The Pope," he said, "believed this would come not from an enemy, but from a mirror, a figure that imitates but does not understand. As if by mimicking goodness, he would influence the people, then drain them of their essence, slowly, insidiously." The host finally broke the silence. "Perhaps this is already happening," he said. Jeremy nodded. "He told me," he whispered, "faith is no longer collapsing because of reality. It's collapsing because of illusion. People are tired of the show. Their souls are still hungry." The host shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing at the production team as if hoping for a commercial break. But no one intervened. Jeremy continued, "The Pope said that the next big step for the church may not be taken by the church itself." His words hung in the room, dark but sincere. The host asked, his voice slowly rising, "So the mission will pass to someone else?" Jeremy did not answer directly. His eyes were back on his rosary. "Faith must evolve," he said, "but before that, it could fall into the wrong hands." The room had grown ice cold. No one moved. No one whispered. This was no longer a program. It was a rite of passage. The host tried to regain control. "These are big ideas, Jeremy. Theology, power, prophecy. Maybe we should take a break?" Jeremy's voice didn't rise, but it was sharp and clear. "No." It cut through the air like a knife. "This isn't a story. It's a warning, and it's not over." The host didn't know what to say. He leaned back. Jeremy continued without blinking. "That night at the Vatican, I came back. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends." He reached for the folder on the table. He pulled out an old piece of paper. A year later, this arrived. He showed the paper. It was old. There was no seal, no signature. He began to read slowly. "Do not open the envelope. There are forces watching you. He is surrounding you. It is not you. Stay in the shadows. Silence protects you more than you think." The host leaned forward. His tension was evident on his face. "This sounds like a threat." Jeremy shook his head. This was just the first. Over the next 4 years, 6 more letters arrived, all from different places, all written by different hands. But the message was the same. Don't tell anyone what you know. The host asked, "Someone on the inside?" Jeremy narrowed his eyes and replied, "At first I thought so. But over time, the pieces began to fit together." Jeremy placed the letter on the table and took a deep breath. "The suspicious deaths of reformist priests," he said. "Journalists who disappeared while investigating the Vatican's financial records. Forgotten notes, marginalia, symbols in old Bibles. It all pointed to something, but it was just a whisper." The host wanted to speak but had to swallow his words. Jeremy narrowed his eyes and continued. "I found a name, actually, a phrase." He turned his gaze to the camera. "S candidate." There was a surge of electricity in the studio, a noticeable ripple among the audience. No one knew what it meant, but it clearly carried an instinctive thread. "Latin," said Jeremy. "It means nameless. This isn't an organization, it's not a community. It's a belief, a silent, secret network of people who no longer trust the church but haven't given up on God." The host whispered, "Did the Pope trust them?" Jeremy shook his head. "No, he feared them, but he also knew they were necessary because the church in its current state couldn't withstand what was coming." Silence again. Deep, unnatural silence. And then Jeremy spoke the words that changed everything. "At that moment, I understood. The Pope hadn't chosen me by chance." The host looked up. "What do you mean?" Jeremy's eyes darkened, but not from fear, from the weight of memories. "He saw something in me, something I couldn't see." He scanned the audience. Then he leaned forward again. He pulled another page from the folder. This paper was old, but slightly newer. The edges were curled, bearing the marks of time. The host didn't speak. He knew they were now beyond the realm of performance. "This," said Jeremy, "came a few weeks before the Pope died." He lowered his eyes. "It didn't say who it was from. It was just slipped under the door of my hotel room." He held up the paper. No seal, no signature, just a yellowed piece of paper. A single message typed on a typewriter. Jeremy read slowly. "You are surrounded. If you open the envelope, you will face the consequences. Silence protects more than you think." The audience began to stir. The host's eyes widened, his face trembling. Jeremy didn't look away. "I didn't know what it meant," he said. "But then," he paused. Then the letters kept coming. He shook his head slowly. They were all different. Different handwriting, different paper. But they all said the same thing. His voice dropped. "Be silent. Don't speak. Don't share." "Be quiet." Jeremy repeated the words in his mind for a moment. The host finally asked, "Did you try to find out who sent them?" Jeremy shook his head slowly. "I tried," he said. "I hired private investigators. I had connections in Europe. But the result? Nothing." His gaze sharpened. No fingerprints, no camera footage, no trace. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. He pulled a thin, worn file from under the desk. He opened it. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, scribbled pages, photographs. He carefully placed some of them on the table. "At first, when I was trying to make connections, I thought I was being paranoid," Jeremy said. "You know, when you start seeing patterns where there aren't any." He picked up a photograph and held it a little longer. A young man, a priest with bright eyes. "This is Father Matteo," he said. "He ran youth programs in Palermo. He had questioned unexplained movements in church funds. Then he disappeared on his way to Rome. No trace." He showed another clipping. An Italian headline. "The body of a journalist found in the Tiber River." He was investigating real estate connections between the Vatican and some companies in South America. They said it was suicide, but he had published an expose 2 days earlier. The host could no longer hide his unease. He swallowed hard where he sat, but Jeremy didn't stop. "I found some old, handwritten Bibles," he said. "They're not in the catalogs. They don't appear digitally. Notes, written in the margins, in Latin, with symbols. Some are understandable, others clearly hidden." He slid a piece of paper across the table. On it was a roughly drawn eye and 3 words below it. "Snowman vivid. Without name lives." An entity without a name, Jeremy said in a low voice, or one that hides its name. At that moment, the studio fell silent. The host reached for his water glass, but didn't drink. No one said a word. Jeremy continued without looking away. Then I noticed something even more unsettling. He paused, his voice grew quieter. The Pope didn't just see potential in me. He leaned against the table. He saw someone like them. Like them? The host began, but Jeremy continued. Someone who moves secretly, quietly. Someone the world doesn't expect to carry something sacred. He closed the folder. It wasn't because I didn't belong to the church, he said. It was precisely because of that. The host looked at him. He no longer felt like he was conducting an interview. He was simply bearing witness. The host paused for a moment, then asked carefully, "Why you?" Jeremy leaned back. His eyes were fixed on nothing, but his mind was elsewhere. Because of what happened after the dream? The host furrowed his brow. The thing you mentioned earlier. Jeremy shook his head slowly. Yes, he said. The night I opened the envelope, I had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. He scanned the audience. It was like a reminder or a warning. His voice grew quieter. I was in a huge abandoned basilica. Everything was covered in dust. There were no candles, no prayers, just silence. A slight shiver ran through the studio. There was a rumbling in my chest. Even breathing seemed to echo. I didn't know where I was, but it was a sacred but forgotten place. Jeremy paused. Then, he was standing in front of the altar. The host leaned forward. Pope Francis? Jeremy nodded. Yes, but he was different. He wasn't weak. He was glowing. There was a calmness in his eyes, but there was a silence that carried a storm within. The host's voice was almost a whisper. What did he say? Jeremy closed his eyes, then opened them to them. It was as if he were reliving that moment. You think you're just an actor, he said, but I saw the man who carries silence with honor. Everyone in the studio seemed to breathe in at the same time. Jeremy continued. When I woke up, I was trembling. I was soaked in sweat. Nothing has been the same since that night. The host watched him intently. Did he know he was going to die, he asked. Jeremy didn't answer right away. Finally, his voice came out very softly. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of dying for nothing. These words weighed heavily on the room. Jeremy turned back to the table. He reached for the folder slowly. He pulled something else out. And that's why I'm here tonight. His voice was clear but heavy. I'm going to show you something you weren't meant to see. Silence fell over the studio. The host didn't speak. The audience didn't move. Something had changed. Jeremy was no longer just a guest. In that moment, he was a messenger. He took a deep breath. This dream was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. He placed his hands on the table. It wasn't like a dream. It was real, as if it had been entrusted to me. His eyes seemed to be lost in the darkness. I was in an empty, vast church. The silence wasn't just still. It was pressing down like the skyline. Dust hung in the air. Every step I took echoed off the walls. He paused. I didn't know where I was, but it was sacred, and it had been abandoned. His eyes cleared. He was waiting there, the Pope, but he wasn't sick. He was strong. He was like light. The presenter leaned forward. What did he say? Jeremy scanned the audience. It was as if he were speaking to each of them individually. You thought you were just playing a man of faith, he said to me. But you were always more than that. You carry silence like a cloak, and you carry it with honor. He paused for a moment. The church is drowning in its own echoes, he said. God's voice has been lost beneath the noise for centuries. And to hear it again, that's something only someone who understands silence can do. The host swallowed, his eyes welling up. Do you really believe he was the one? Jeremy didn't answer. Then he confessed in a low voice, I don't know what to think, but it changed me. He leaned back in his chair. I quit my job, not the movie, not the show. I started reading the sacred texts, theology, the secret writings, even the Apocrypha. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I write every night, thoughts, symbols, questions. Sometimes it feels like I'm not the one writing. The host was visibly shaken. So, are you afraid? He asked. Yershmi was silent at first. Then he took a deep breath. I was scared for a long time, he said. But maybe fear is just the first test. He turned to his rosary. He touched it slowly with his finger. You know, he said, the Pope told me something else in my dream. The host waited. Silence will be a door, he said. But will you let others in through that door? Or will you keep it locked forever? That is your choice. There was a long silence. The host looked around. He was clearly unprepared. I didn't expect this to happen tonight. Jeremy smiled for the first time in minutes. But it wasn't a warm smile. He was tired, exhausted. When I entered the Vatican, I didn't expect this. But waiting isn't enough anymore. The host asked, why now? Why are you telling all this on live TV? Jeremy looked at the camera. Because the truth is quieter than lies. And if I don't speak now, maybe I'll never be able to speak again. He leaned back. And I need to show you something else. The host asked hesitantly, is it dangerous? Jeremy paused. Maybe. But what scares me more is what will happen if I don't show it. He reached into the folder. He pulled out a small, rectangular object. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear, from inevitability. The host leaned forward. What is it? Jeremy, his head bowed, slowly raised the object. A photo from that night at the Vatican, he said, taken by someone else. A special moment. The studio held its breath. Me, the Pope, and we were in that garden. He turned the photo over, but he didn't show his face to the camera. There's someone else in it, he said. The host asked, his voice trembling. What? Jeremy looked at the photo. In the background, a hooded silhouette. It's very hard to make out. He placed the photo on the table away from the camera. Only you can see it, not yet. This figure has appeared in 3 different photos that have come into my possession over the years. It's always there, always watching, but never in the open. The host whispered, who is this? Jeremy raised his head. I don't know. Before the silence fell, he added one last sentence. The Pope warned me, in my dream. Before you see the light, you will see the shadow. He turned the photo so the cameras couldn't see it. This is me and the Pope, he said, walking in the garden that night. He pointed to the corner. Look behind the trees, there's a hooded figure. The host squinted. It could be anyone, Besso, he said. Jeremy shook his head. The same figure in the other 3 photos. Different countries, different dates. But he's always there, silent, distant, watching. He pulled out the other photos from the folder. He laid them out on the table. He blocked the cameras. The Pope's last words to me were, he said, you will see the shadow before you see the light. The host fell silent. Jeremy added, this isn't a threat. It's a warning. Something is coming. He stood up. And it won't be the church that faces it. It will be us. He turned around and took a few steps. Then he turned back and added, faith is not dead. It is waiting. And remember, silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it is the beginning of war. The curtain in the background fluttered slightly. Jeremy stopped. He gave one last look. And if you think this is over, he paused. Wait, his eyes darkened, because what comes next is much darker.